Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and on this episode of the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, Greg Horton and I begin a conversation about 10 not-so-shocking things that you learn in Religion 101. That's right. But first, before we jump into that conversation, I want to let you know that I am really pumped that you're listening. It's quite a bit of fun to do these Homebrewed Christianity podcasts, and it's always exciting to hear from you, to connect with listeners, our listeners that we call deacons, because here at Homebrewed Christianity, we want to bring you some of the best ingredients in our interviews so that you can brew your own faith. One that's tasty, zesty, and full of life. That's right. So it is quite a pleasure to get to do this, and I hope that you connect with us, be it on Twitter, like @TripFuller, or @Debo Sanders, my sidekick, and maybe you can go over to our Facebook site, Homebrewed Christianity, like it and comment and stuff like that. Come to homebrewedchristianity.com and leave us a message. Subscribe to this show and all the others that we do, like Theology Nerd Throwdown. If you subscribe on iTunes and rate it, then it helps others find out about the show. Last, you can support it. Anytime you're going to shop on Amazon, just click through any Amazon link on homebrewedchristianity.com, and a percentage of what you purchase will then come to us, and it'll help pay for the website, the hosting, and all that kind of stuff. So you can do it that way. You can click the PayPal donate button, and you can just send us a few bucks that way. You can tell your theological institution you should sponsor the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, because all the theology nerds across the country are listening to it. Don't you want them to come to your divinity school, your seminary? Let them know about it. They could sponsor the podcast. There's lots of ways. But anyway, the main way is that we like the best is to hear from you, your voice. On the homebrewedchristianity.com website, there's a button. It says Speak Pipe. When you click it, your computer's microphone comes on, and it's like sending us a voicemail. You can tell us what you think. You can do an impersonation. You can leave a question, a topic, interview idea, all kinds of stuff. There you go. You can do that, and it would be awesome. Lastly, I just want you to know that Greg Horton and I have so much fun in this interview of 10 not-so-shocking things that you learn in Religion 101 that we don't get through all 10, and it ends up being a whole nother episode. But this is a very jam-packed hour full of nerdiness and delight. Thank you, Greg Horton, for coming on the podcast. Go to the homepage. You can find links to his Twitter, his blog, and all that kind of stuff. Or you can just Google Greg Horton. Like the Who, like Greg Horton, Here's a Who. Or, there was a Dr. Seuss book, Horton, Here's a Who. Man. Hello. Peace. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. Today's your lucky day, because it is. It's not always easy to convince someone that y'all really love to come back on, and sometimes y'all get really excited about interviews. That I think to myself, I asked every question I can think of. What am I going to talk to this person about again? But the deacons, they say, bring them back. Well, today, the Twitterverse was all amuck when Greg Horton, ex-pastor on Twitter, was on the podcast last time, and we were talking about 10 things that most people in the church don't know that their ministers have to deal with and are going to deal with in ministry. And today, he is back on, and we're going to be talking about 10 not-so-shocking things you learn in Religion 101. Now, Greg, thank you for coming back on the podcast, and begin by just briefly telling us why in the world would I be talking to you about what happens in a Religion 101 class.
Well, thanks for having me back, first of all. The reason why we chose this, I think, after our last conversation, I teach religion at a couple of different schools, and right now I'm in the middle of a religion class, actually, because every summer I teach it at a local offshoot of Oklahoma State University. So I end up with kids in my class all the time that have been raised in some form of faith, many of them church, because it is Oklahoma after all. So I get those kids and they get in my class, and they're typically comfortable with conversations about Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam or whatever, depending on their faith background. But once I get to the generic sort of issues related to religion, as well as to the specifics of Christianity, things get a little bit tense.
Mm-hmm. So, on Twitter, you're ex-pastor, and if they haven't listened to the previous podcast, just a brief little catch-you-up, dear listener. I learned about Greg Horton when he was a pastor yet to become ex on a podcast network many, many moons ago called The Wired Parish. And listening to that made me think, well, I can talk. So I started the Homebrewed Christianity podcast back in 2008. So Greg, back then, was on a podcast. He's a wonderful blogger who does excellent wine reviews. And so, it was like meeting one of your, those people you stalk on the internet when we finally got to meet in Oklahoma. So it's just a little treat to get to hang out with him. But if someone says to you, Greg, why did you leave Christianity? What's that about? Most people just would not understand that are Christians why you'd want to leave this beautiful faith.
Do you mean to answer that question, the short version?
Yeah. Just
students ask me every semester, Trip. I mean, because of my background in theology and philosophy, I tend not to let students pretend that they're unbiased observers of the world. And so, to be fair, I tell them my background, my biases. And so when I mentioned that I was a pastor for roughly 14 years, it's even more shocking that a Christian would leave the faith who was also a pastor. And so I always get the question, what happened? And it's not like it's an easy question to answer, but the short version is, I took a graduate degree in theology, which was heavy on philosophy, and it taught me to frame questions in ways that made me uncomfortable with traditional theistic answers. And so I reverted to sort of old kind of Greek category of skepticism because I'm just not convinced.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I am. All
right. So here we go. We are going to. I guess one aside from that is, and it comes up in the first of our little 10 list here, is that your skepticism, agnosticism, and that kind of thing isn't a kind of violent, angry critique of your faith from the past and that kind of thing. So I know a lot of people will notice as we're talking that there is like genuine interest, care, and attentiveness to the faith, and there's still parts of it that are attractive, and you're more comfortable probably emphasizing the scary parts.
Yeah, I like to tell students I'm not opposed to religion or faith. I'm opposed to toxic versions of those things. And so we work really hard to deconstruct what that means. But, I still have friends in the faith, friends who are in the ministry still. And I recognize that not just the functional aspect of religion, but the ability, the transformative nature of it to turn people from douchebags into non-douchebags. It's a good sort of method. It's as good as other methods. So I don't really have a huge problem with it in as much as it doesn't become one of those things that is, angry, controlling, manipulative, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I'm not hostile to it. And I do find it fascinating, especially in terms of how it impacts public policy.
All right, so here we go. 10 not so shocking things you learn in Religion 101. Number 10 here. The utterly valid atheist critique of public faith and faith in public policy. What's going on here, Greg?
Okay, so, every semester, and this isn't just true in school, this is true nationwide, people are more likely to vote for any kind of theist over an atheist for president. I've never understood this. What is it about atheists that scare people? And so the other day, this actually came to me in this semester, I asked students, do you think atheism offers a sort of valid critique of the sort of liberties that religion, especially theism, takes in the context of public policy and in the way it tries to dictate conversations? And I was a little bit distressed to hear them say, no, not at all. So that all these atheists, now I'll grant you they can be a little angry, a little polemical, but in terms of trying to understand how faith and culture and politics interact in the center of our lives, to say that this group of people who are essentially saying something like this, if you don't like the idea of living in, let's say, Dearborn, Michigan, and having a majority Muslim population telling you what you ought to do or how your school curriculum ought to look, then why would it be okay for me living in Oklahoma with this majority Christian population to sort of force that, same sort of view or lifestyle on others? And they really fail to understand that religion, while it has its place and while you can certainly vote your conscience in a poll or polling booth, if it's a majority rule sort of approach, then which the majority is going to matter how you handle this thing. So what I like to say is, I don't call myself an atheist, by the way. I don't know if any people are always trying to even atheists are trying to force me into that category, but I don't call myself that. But what I do like that they're trying to say is that if you're going to make these claims about how religion should impact our politics, our laws, then you ought to bring at least some viable form of evidence that shows me that you're correct. If you can't prove to me one text is right and the other is wrong, why are we even having this conversation?
Mm-hmm. And that comes up in a number of different areas. Like in religion classes, I think it can reveal, like when you walk in, any religion class that is semi-diverse, the moment you walk in it and start talking about topics, questions, ethics, religion, politics, all these kinds of things you normally only talk about with people that are surprisingly similar to you, a Religion 101 class reveals just how ideologically sheltered most people are, and how there are these constant assumptions that are in fact strong judgments that we've passively received and have intensely acted upon. It just comes out because all of a sudden you're sitting next, a conservative evangelical is next to a liberal Protestant, a Catholic, a Baha'i, and a Muslim, and three atheists who keep rolling their eyes at all of them. And then the liberal Protestant's like, no, I'm like really on your team. It's just I pray. And all these things go on, and all these assumptions show up. And I wonder, just thinking, you're in Oklahoma.
Right.
I mean, I think y'all like try to outdo everyone on crazy political ideas that don't even make sense in other parts of the country where everyone's Christian. Like, y'all are notorious for having I mean, he's having trouble these days with a number of new senators, but at least Legend, the captain of ignoramus senators, with Senator Inhofe, who has a whole book dedicated to why global warming is not an issue based on weird ideas about the Bible and things. So, being in Oklahoma, when that kind of stuff happens, what goes on in a class when you just have a senator, like one of 50, put their foot in their mouth and is in charge of science funding distribution for the United States government?
Yeah. Okay. Look, years ago, I wanted to move out of this place. I did. I mean, I've been here since '92, and I really wanted to leave. And the longer I stayed, and the more I've learned to love it, and actually the better Oklahoma City's gotten overall, just in terms of being a real city, the more I believe that we really need sane people in this state. I mean, and I'm not saying I'm perfectly sane, because clearly I'm not, but the idea that I could move to Portland or Seattle or Austin, Texas, or Madison, Wisconsin, to a city that's kind of halfway cool with culture, was a really, really sort of an attractive idea. But then a couple of friends and I discussed the idea that, what if we just stayed and tried to do as much good as we can in terms of working in this climate? And so that's what we've done. And what I do in class now, and trust me, I taught in one of the most country-ass colleges in Oklahoma until just this last semester, Redlands in El Reno, Oklahoma. And all you can honestly do is try to teach the skills necessary to think through half of the bullshit that's being said by our politicians on a regular basis. Mary Fallin, our lovely, lovely governor, just signed a law that you now have to attend divorce school before you can get a divorce. So it's always shocking to me that our Republican politics here, our politicians here, are always saying that they're for limited government or smaller government. But it turns out that the only things they want to be invasive about are the really deeply personal things like marriage and divorce and birth control and that sort of stuff. So what you have to do, I guess, is just hold the things side by side and ask students in a very Jon Stewart sort of way to look at the absurdity. I think satire is back, and I think it's back because we've reached a point where, honestly, Kurt Vonnegut would walk around with satire boner all day long and just write chapter after chapter about what happens in Oklahoma politics. It's amazing where we are right now.
And one of the things that a Religion 101 class does in kind of revealing an ideology you've kind of passively have and appropriated is it helps you understand the critique that that atheists put when it goes to faith and public policy, because it's so easy for us to basically put ourselves in an ideological bubble. And one of the things, I mean, it's been on the news recently and things, is how like even Google and Facebook and things on the web, this open place, kind of know human beings want to be ideological sheltered. So once it learns that I'm really progressive politically, it's not going to put shared items from my right-wing friends on my Facebook feed. And when I Google something, different things come up as the top result. But when my right-wing uncle does, different things are going to come up on the first page. So I think the atheist critique is important, but more important, I think, is just when you take existence seriously from a religious or a non-religious view. If truth matters in any sense, then dealing with issues that are important, like the viability of life on our planet, how you will use legislative power to occupy female genitalia or not, or any of those type of issues, just need to be addressed from some place other than this anxious, in fear, protective posture where our identity is always under threat.
Yes. No, yeah, absolutely. And the thing that makes me, honestly, along that line, what's happened with the kind of Christianity that's practiced in Oklahoma is that. So there is no emphasis on ethics. That's a different conversation for a different time. But it's this sort of practiced community ethic that respects other people and other views and other perspectives, that it gets lost in a sort of triumphalism that happens when you have a state. 1 in 4 people I meet here are Baptist in one form or another. 1 in 4, that's insane. I think only South Carolina beats us in religiosity. And that's, they got palmetto bugs and religion. Go South Carolina. So I don't know what else to say except that if you don't teach young people how to get along with each other, how to converse, how to respect each other, then all of those questions later on, they will begin as people who are teachers or pastors or politicians to use the legislative power that they have as a majority to sort of try to change the way that we live our lives, including our uteruses, uteri, divorce, marriages, and so religion class offers them an opportunity to understand the ethics of what it is they're supposed to be doing. And I'm appalled and astounded, honestly, all the time when I get kids who have been raised in the church who don't know anything about the ethics of Jesus or the ethics that they're supposed to be practicing as a Christian, other than don't have sex, don't be gay, don't get an abortion.
Well, I just can't figure out how any female Christians think it's a good idea to make a woman who's been abused by their husband sit in divorce counseling with them before they're allowed to separate themselves from a violent offender who obviously failed to live up to any covenantal obligations. But nonetheless, number nine, should people be allowed to self-identify?
A lovely segue, sir. Very well done.
Or the ethics of theism. Should people be allowed to self-identify, or the ethics of theism?
Okay, so let's take your last question or your last moment of consternation that you just said, and let's apply that right now. Let's say that we have a Republican governor who is ostensibly Christian. Because you know why? Because she says she is. Now then, am I obligated in any way to believe that she's actually Christian? Is there a marker or markers in her life whereby I can judge whether or not she is a Christian person? This is a really, really sort of troubling thing for Americans in general, because we like to believe that you get to say what you are. Self-determination is sort of one of the idolatries of American culture. And so the idea that I'm going to look at you and say, I'm not sure what you call yourself, but a Christian is probably the wrong designation. And this became tremendously important after 9/11. When people who fly planes into buildings then call themselves Muslim, we have to be able to sort out whether or not my sort of self-declaration is an accurate sort of depiction of what I actually am as a person. Because you would never, with a serious face in Oklahoma, say Christian terrorist, but these people do it all the time in terms of Muslim terrorists. They have no trouble whatsoever saying that. And so I ask students every semester, should we trust people at their word when they say, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew? Not the ethnic version, obviously. But do we take them at their word when they say that thing, or should I look at their lives and judge the things that they do? And it's always funny because the initial response is, well, only God knows the heart. Yeah, but if you're punching me in the face and you tell me you believe that you shouldn't punch people in the face, I don't give a shit what you believe. You ultimately judge each other based on actions, not on declarations. And so if you're not going to practice a theistic ethic of any kind, let's not just pick on Christians, but Muslims or Jews or anybody else. The idea is if you're going to say that you're that thing, are you then somehow obligated to practice an ethic that looks even remotely like the thing you say you are?
Yeah. I mean, we see that same problem taking place right now in Iraq and the kind of three different expressions of Islam, all kind of eliminating the others as viable options. And so, I mean, it's clearly not just a Christian thing. Maybe you could say a little bit about this, because you said a line that got passed over. You said that self-identification is an idolatry of American culture. And how is it that this self-identification, this form of idolatry, is revealed as such when you start to engage in a critical and academic study of religion?
Sure. What I said, honestly, was self-determination. And I'm going to say that, Americans have a weird relationship to not just the truth, but to integrating sort of a comprehensive worldview in their lives. And so when you get religious practice specifically, you have to ask the question, what is it about this particular tribe that makes them that tribe? What are the markers? And in a very real sense, in American culture, what has become sacred, what has become the sort of tribal marker of American, has been the idea of choosing. So the choice becomes this sort of dominant way that I, exist or be in the world. And it's the way, in a very existential sense, it's the way that I mark out the kind of person that I am. And I'm kind of comfortable with part of that. But what happens is that instead of making choice something that's just day-to-day or profane in the truest sense, it becomes this sacred sort of thing. And so the idea that as Americans we're allowed to self-determine becomes integral to who we are as Americans. Now then, the idea that I am going to be subject to a scrutiny or a criticism that's going to nullify the choice that I've made to self-declare runs counter to what we believe is the American experience, or even the human experience as Americans. And so this idea that suddenly I get to say what I am and only God knows my heart, well, that's not very helpful if we're trying to really figure out who people are, what they believe, and how I should expect them to respond or act in a given circumstance. Do Muslims really fly planes into buildings and kill innocent people? Do Christians really set off bombs at Olympic parks and try to kill innocent people? I mean, honestly, if you can't insist on some sort of fundamental level of behavior, then why even call yourself anything at all? The point is that if everything that matters is internal, and I can't ever know what you actually are or what you pretend to be, then you call yourself anything, and it just wouldn't matter. You're not defining anything at all. And I know that it's kind of a tricky the other way too to say that all my actions define who I am, but I'm much more comfortable in a world where my actions define me over against my words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that tension is something that, as you look at all the different religious and wisdom traditions, it is something that they all are trying to grapple and wrestle with. There's always this kind of sense of some type of primal brokenness and things about humanity, and an ideal that's put before us, and a struggle to somehow connect and embody them, and which I think if you take any of the wisdom traditions seriously, then you're going to be more of a realist about human situation and human brokenness, and which somehow that not turning into a kind of generous hospitality towards the religious other is problematic. And I think one of the ways we see it in reverse, right, is the inability for people to believe that Barack Obama is a Christian.
Okay, can I cut you off right there for 1 second? Because this happened yesterday in class.
Oh.
This young man, I've been writing about him on the blog lately. I won't name him because he's a student and he has confidentiality. He's a sweet kid, and he's the one whose mom said, "Don't take a class that's going to cause you to doubt." Oh, hell no, I can't have that. And so we were discussing, voting for this kind of president or that kind of president along religious sort of lines. And he started to say Barack Obama, and I could tell when he paused that he was going to say is a Muslim.
Hussein Obama.
And I stopped him. I said, Barack Obama is a Baptist, like you, a Baptist. No. I said, well, not really like you. I said, he comes from a tradition that's far, far different than the white Baptist tradition in Oklahoma, but he's clearly Baptist. And he's like, no. I'm like, what makes you think he's not Baptist? So I went through the whole, Goddamn America sermon and James Cone and the sort of that black tradition that creates a much more radicalized form of Christianity in the Baptist tradition than, say, a Southern Baptist growing up in Oklahoma. And at the end of it, he says, well, there are just certain things that his ideology, I just don't understand. I just can't see that as really Christian. I'm like, didn't you just say that God judges the heart and you can't really mark someone out based on their behaviors? He says, well, yeah, but I don't think and then he was just done. It was over at that point. Because what he wants to say is, when it's necessary, I can other this person. But if it's me personally or my tribe personally, then I'm going to give them as much grace and leeway as possible. Mm-hmm. And I find that really, really distressing.
Yeah. Well, I concur that it is stressing. And yeah. Well, so if you were working at a United Church of Christ Church, and when the whole "Goddamn America" sermon comes out in the election and stuff, he at that point was a member at a UCC church in Chicago, and
right.
And even in our own in another UCC church, the different tone of black religion in America was unhearable to other people of a church that, when they partner for justice activities, political witness, and all those things, they share values. But it was like you overheard the embodied, performed religion of a minority community who is inheriting a religion from their former slave masters, interpreting it and receiving it with a prophetic thrust, and then turning the very language and scriptures and practices of the master's religion against them, and continuing that prophetic impulse you see in the prophets and in Jesus. I mean, like, it is to me, that's one great example of how, even if you're in the same itty-bitty denomination of free church Christianity, Chicago prophetic black religious culture doesn't compute, even in Southern California.
How do you not know your faith when you see it, and a prophet when you hear it? How do you not know? How are you raised in a sort of religious tradition, and then when someone behaves consistently with that tradition, and by the way, he said nothing that wasn't true in that sermon. I've actually made my students read the transcript of the sermon after I've shown a few minutes of the clip, because, quite frankly, saying "goddamn" over and over again in class can be distressing for students who've been raised to believe that's actually a violation of, the fourth commandment, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the fact that they are unable to recognize that what's playing out in front of them is this amazing tableau where a pastor is actually doing what pastors are called to do and have been called to do, and they don't see that, I find that really, really troublesome. It's the idea that, well, what he's doing is political. No, what he's doing is prophetic. And it just so happens that prophetic affects politics, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and it's not even as strong as MLK sermons. Because, I mean, he used metaphors of America getting in bed with Satan and having demonic offspring. Anyway, so but they didn't have YouTube then, or I'm sure that I'm sure that people would have figured out a way to edit him out of having a day dedicated on the calendar. Speaking of damning things to hell, number 8.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
You're the master of the segue. I just can't say.
That's blowing people's minds. But number 8, heaven, hell, and Zoroaster's influence on Western theism. What's a Zoroaster?
What's a Zoroaster? Okay, this is one of those moments in class where I just, this is specifically related to growing up in the church and walking into a religion class thinking, this should be fun. And then having someone, well, let me take a little excursus here for a second. We used to have a church. We still have a church. And there are probably others in the metro that do this. Every summer, they do a college boot camp. And so they get their young little chickens together that are about to go off to a scary state university or state college. And they have this boot camp that's supposed to sort of insulate them from the sort of scary professors like me, the atheist people. And in doing that, they tell them things that are, profoundly not true. And it's not so much the overt sort of indoctrination like that that's the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that overt indoctrination reveals that there has been a lack of education at the systemic level in evangelical and fundamentalist churches, such that they don't even know where their own ideas of heaven and hell come from. Mm-hmm. So that when a student in my class ends up reading Genesis 3, and I explain that the serpent's not the devil, there's no devil in Judaism, they're astonished because, well, that's the way they've always been taught to read it. And so I recognize, having been a pastor for all those years, that you can't really wear your congregation out with all this academic stuff. But what you ought to be able to do, at least, is tell the truth. And so when I get these kids in class and we're talking about the development of Judaism, we talk about the captivity, we talk about the exposure to the Persian Zoroastrianism, and the sort of dualism that was inherent in Zoroaster's cosmology, the idea that there is a good God and a dark sort of other, and then there's this battle between darkness and light, and that if you choose the right side, you get to go to this sort of afterlife of light and heaven and paradise, and if you choose wrongly, you get to go to this place of fire and darkness. And it's clear that that's where the sort of heaven and hell tradition enter into it, not theology, but certainly the Jewish lexicon. Now, by the time of Jesus, that's clearly entered into the Jewish theology at some level. But and by Maimonides, right, it's fully part of the whole spectrum of Judaism. However, they've never heard that before. And as far as they're concerned, there is a hell because why? Because Jesus said so. Mm-hmm. And so, very much like Muslims treat the Quran, Christians who have been raised in that tradition treat those kinds of utterances as if they are in fact facts. And when I talk to my Muslim students, they have a little harder time with this because they'll say to me, what are your facts? When I start talking about this, I'm like, facts? Well, I can show you the history of it. We have documentation. And they're like, no. And when they mean facts, they mean, what does the Quran say about it? Mm-hmm. Now, that's far more troublesome than how Christians mean facts when they say it like that. Nonetheless, both those traditions have a tremendously difficult time hearing this. And so the idea that there is this place of punishment, this place of paradise, doesn't enter into the lexicon of our faith because Jesus said so. It enters in because this group of people were exposed to a particular teaching that seemed consistent with the worldview they already had, and some of the people liked it and they adopted it. Now then, beyond just the specifics of that case, what that shows is that there is a living tradition that incorporates things from outside of that tradition things to build a larger tradition. Students who haven't been prepared to hear this find this very, very, very distressing. Yeah. And it's at that point where what they do is they revert to that damn phrase that I'm so tired of hearing, that it's a matter of faith. It's like, it's not a matter of faith, it's a matter of history. Your faith won't overturn history in the sense of this really did happen.
Yeah. And I think part of it is connected to just such a poor understanding of what faith is, that's what you're concerned about. Because, the thing in the garden, in the snake being Satan, that's John Milton's fault. He wrote this amazing political, theological text, Paradise Lost, and then, literalist Christians read it just like they read the Bible, poorly, and then they combine forces for wonderfully shitty eschatology.
Yes.
And this divine dualistic battle. But the thing that if you just sit in like the history of Christianity or Christian doctrine or the little part on Christianity is that overwhelming most of the Bible does not care about continued subjective existence.
Right.
And when it ever happens to talk about it, it isn't even clear. Like the idea evolves in the Bible, and it's not a bad thing that it evolves. And in fact, the questions that the Jewish people are asking, where the afterlife or continued subjective existence in some form comes into being, are good questions to ask, and they're monotheistic questions. The reason the idea of the afterlife evolved was because the Jewish people are affirming a one good God who made the world. And then you look at the world and realize that bad things happen to good people, justice isn't the reality, and yet you want to know an answer to this question. And so different forms of hope develop and evolve, and at the end of Scripture, at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures and at the time of Jesus was the development of apocalyptic Judaism that recognized that the promise of God's good character coming to define God's good creation was going to take an apocalyptic intervention from God. And how is it that you say a good God is in charge of a world where children are born to suffer and die and have no hope? Like, we can think of the Holocaust, we can think of people dying with or being born with diseases where they suffer and they die. We can think of individuals whose personality shattered by abuse early on. All these types of things, when you go, a good God made a good world, you go, really? And what kind of future does the world have such that God remains good? And apocalyptic Judaism is one of the developments. The afterlife as a place where God's justice finally comes to reign is there. But the important thing for Christians or any monotheist to see, it was never about the individuals. It was about God. Subjective existence, if you call it invented or developed, or if you want to talk about it historically, but the idea came into being because the people of God insisted God was good despite the evidence of history. And to think that this idea that developed because we wanted to say that God is still good turns into an idea that we then beat over the head of people, torturing their existence, demonizing the other, and in fact turning our attention away from the very material existence God's passion was always directed towards is problematic. The afterlife is a way in which God's passion for the world and God's goodness could still be viable, not a reason for us to turn away from sharing in God's passion for justice and equity and things in this world. Anyway, it drives me nuts, and it's like you find out the thing developed, and then you just start defending a crappy version of eschatology.
Yes, and in the conversations that we have about heaven and hell, you try to be as fair about as possible, paradise or whatever. The idea that hell exists as a place where justice can be, realized, and that heaven exists as a place where justice can be realized is a perfectly understandable sort of way of approaching, a religious study of this thing. Because you do want to believe that if a 3-year-old dies of some awful childhood disease, that she gets a shot eventually, right? And so there's this chance. Now, of course, I'm sure Neoplatonism didn't help our idea that all individual souls are eternal. And that certainly has contributed to this sort of individualistic sort of rubric that we use to talk about paradise and punishment. Nonetheless, if you can get students to embrace the idea that it's really about justice, that at least gets the subject on the right track. The problem, of course, is that evangelical Christianity has made hell not a place of justice, but a place for people who make wrong choices. particular wrong choice. So that hell isn't even for bad people anymore. It's not even for people so that justice can be fully realized. It's a place where you go if you just make a mistake in terms of where you're born or what you believe or what God you serve. And so now they've even subverted the justice aspect of it such that you can be a shitty person and get into heaven and a really awesome person and get into hell.
Well, we don't know what Hitler did with his last breath.
There were the thieves on the cross. Remember the thieves?
So here's one of the things that just looking at the history is I think helpful. So in the early church, they're kind of inheriting this apocalyptic Judaism that Jesus modifies, and there's arguments among historical Jesus scholars as how he appropriates it. But like take someone like Gregory of Nyssa, not a radical leftist, the guy who invented how the Trinity works. He reads these passages like, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, even to death on a cross, so that, God raises him up so that the name of Jesus, every tongue confess on earth, under the earth, and above it, that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. He hears this and goes, oh, great. Well, now we know how the good God demonstrates God's eternal goodness by bringing through loving, suffering, compassionate engagement, the redemption of all of existence. There's a reason that everything above, on, and under the earth bends the knee and confesses to the glory of God that Jesus Christ is Lord, because God has redeemed all things. And so this logic in the early church extends to a form of universalism, because it was about God. It's not about us. And when you look at the early church fathers and how they understand even the fires of hell, in quotes, it's a purifying reality on behalf of the redemption of the individual. Not like God's like, oh, I'm going to get you. But God says, no, I want to love you. And this is a loving engagement with God to be embraced in the divine life. Like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, that the Son conquers sin, law, and death, so that all things become subject to the Son, so the Son becomes subject to the Father, so that God may be in all in all. Like the what is being judged is sin, law, and death,
right?
Not individuals. God knows that we are broken in a broken world and need to be redeemed and transformed, and God intends to do it, so that God may be all in all. And when the God of love is all in all, you tell me what's left out. Like, this is why the history of it shouldn't be scary, because in a sense, the way the eschatology develops in the early church actually comes to overcome the kind of dualism in Zoroaster's form that they appropriate on behalf of the monotheistic commitments. The same way, like when people freak out about the Epic of Gilgamesh and parallels in Genesis, but just look at the theology that's being communicated and how they appropriate the stories. Right. So, can you say a bit about in that? Well, I guess this is coming up in number 5, so we'll skip it. But just to say, I think that there are like at least two responses when you look at the historical development of the afterlife. Like one is to go, well, I guess God didn't decree once and for all how this works or something, and right. So therefore, I'm just going to believe whatever I believe in faith or reject it. And another, I think, is looking at when you look at how the ideas function, what it inspires and what it compels, then the story of a development of the idea it can be understood and related to in faith as well as as a historical question. Right.
So that whole idea that there's a development of these sort of things requires a bit of ability to allow a metaphor to exist as a metaphor. So that the fires of hell are not for punishment, they're for purification, they're for the transformation of the person. Let's assume the place even exists at all. But then to say that the fire is a metaphor for this sort of transformative experience or this purification because God really needs you to be a certain way, that makes way more sense. But what literalism does, of course, is it flattens all metaphors.
Yeah. So, and luckily, there is no such thing as biblical literalist, nor a Quranic one either. Number 7, boom shakalaka laka. No such thing as biblical literalist, nor a Quranic one either.
Do I get credit for the segue?
You do. I feel like you bumped it and said it, and then I spiked it. And
that's another metaphor.
Yes.
An analogy, even. Okay, yeah. So the idea, of course, and I'm going to flip off the screen here, and because I used this in class last week, and the Gallup group put out this new study. I don't know if you saw it, about the Bible and American culture. How here's the numbers: 3 in 4 in the U.S. still see the Bible as the Word of God. Now we'll get to that in a little bit too. But one of the ones that stood out for me, the most important of which, is this: that still to this day, 28% of the population believe that the Bible is to be taken literally word for word. I don't even know what that means. I mean, I have no idea what it means. The idea that, honestly, it's like, if you've actually, here's the problem. People don't read the damn book. If you actually read the thing, you realize that there are whole portions where you're just like, I have no idea what I just read. And I'm certainly not going to take that literally. Now, so when they say it should be taken literally, I think they don't really understand what literally means. And the simplest, of course, is when Jesus says, if your eye offends you, gouge it out. He doesn't really mean to do that. That's not what he's talking about there. It's metaphor. But literalism is always uncomfortable with metaphors because ultimately they have to know what the words actually mean. So when you say fire or hellfire, and you look at it as this sort of metaphor for this purification process, that makes way more sense than this place where there's actually, like, God has carved out some sort of region in the universe where it's all fire all the time. And that's where we're going to kick it for all eternity after we fuck up so badly that we're not welcome anymore. And honestly, we're not even going to go there for that. We just make the wrong choice, but whatever. But the idea, of course, is that they think that you should take the Bible literally. And what that really means, I think, is that you should selectively read certain things literally, as long as those certain things support the view that I have of the Bible and God and religion and Christianity in ways that make me still feel like I can continue to believe what it is I believe. Because no one believes that book literally word for word all the way through. It's impossible to do.
Yeah.
Now,
and Bill Maher had Ralph Reed on last week, and
Ralph these days.
And he said, Ralph, like 28% of the country takes the Bible literally. Are you one of those? And he said, yep. And he goes, all right, question. If a woman commits adultery, take her outside the city and stone her. And he's like, while Jesus says, and there's a woman caught in adultery, and he writes on the ground, "He without sin cast the first stone." He goes, that's nice. Jesus is awesome. I completely agree with him. I'm just telling you, you aren't taking this literally.
Your very methodology means you're not taking it literally, because now you've got two different sort of passages there. What are you supposed to do with both of them?
And Ralph goes, well, Bill, that's in the Old Testament. We're under a new covenant. He goes, oh, so you're going to blame it on the Jews, are you?
Oh.
And he's like, well, no, not exactly. So, like, you couldn't help but laugh at him. And these horrible, nonsensical comebacks still had, in Bill Maher's audience, people clapping for Ralph Reed. And I think that just shows you that whatever people mean by biblical literalism, it's not literalism. It is some way of saying, sociologically, something. And that's why I think the study of religion is interesting. Where did biblical literalism come from, Greg?
Biblical literalism probably emerges right about the end of the 19th century, 18th century, when we begin that whole process of being really, really scared of the Enlightenment. And then, of course, by the time you get to the fundamentals, the 1920s, 1930s, in terms of those guys that are leaving Princeton to form Westminster, and even before that, the collection of essays that goes on to be the fundamentals, there becomes this insistence that the text is the text and it should be taken as such, because higher criticism has begun to deconstruct the text and treat it like gasp literature, and then it's asking crazy questions like, what genre is this? And what canonical criticism says, why is this text here and this one there, and why aren't these all together, and how did this happen, and who redacted this, and what happened to that? And that makes people deeply uncomfortable, because once you admit that there is a process, and this is the same thing with the hell and heaven conversation. Once you admit there's a process, then you have to start talking about how the process happens. So it's just easier to say, well, the whole damn thing is true from cover to cover. and it's always been true, and it's God's word. And then in the worst twist, in the worst turn, I should say, in the history of Bible interpretation, what you end up doing is you make the Bible an object of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It was never intended to be an object of faith. That's crazy to me. What are you, a Catholic now? For real? You're a Protestant. You're going to agree that the councils that put this thing together, which were Catholic by their very nature, were somehow, divinely driven by God. And this is what you're supposed to have. Never mind what Luther did with the Apocrypha. That was just a hiccup. Everything's fine. We have this thing now, so we're going to deal with it as it is. But the process now looks like it's a little more, hurly-burly than that, a little more troublesome. And so then you get the Chicago State on inerrancy, right? So that they're going to get together really, really smart people, and they're going to get together. They're going to say, well, the Bible is without error in its original autographs. That'd be awesome if those things actually existed, but they don't, because a good part of it was oral tradition for a long, long time. And even if there was the first piece of vellum where the Genesis was written on, it's been destroyed, lost to history for thousands of years. So anyway, we get this idea of literalism coming out of that sort of reaction against the Enlightenment, and it's not helpful to faith. It's not helpful to Christianity at all. And students who wander into my class and think that they take the Bible literally are going to be in trouble just as soon as we get to the Sermon on the Mount, because no one takes that seriously. That's where I start using the phrase, and listen, let me say this up front, my caveat. Whether or not Jesus is the Son of God, I don't know. What he is, in many ways, is just amazingly polarizing for the best reasons. And so when I start talking about literalism and asking them if they take the Bible literally, they say yes, and then I start reading what I call silly Jesus stuff. He couldn't have meant this. He didn't, Yeah. I know you take it literally, but when he says, love your enemies, you don't mean that. You mean, drop drones on them in Pakistan. You mean love them till you have to shoot them on a battlefield in Iraq. That's what he really meant, right? Love them until they break into my house and I have to shoot them. That silly Jesus didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Now, we'll get to WWJD later, obviously. But this idea that literalism is the sort of overarching rubric by which you should read the Bible, it falls apart in seconds.
And it's not even historic. The church, from the very beginning, learned to read sacred text from very gifted sacred text readers called Jewish people. And there's always been multiple senses of scriptures. Be it if you talk to Augustine, Aquinas, Origen, there's multiple senses of scriptures. Analogical, you'll have analogical readings, metaphorical ones here, symbolic, literal, historical, all these different possible readings. And what we do when we do, quote, just literal reading, it's like you have this really awesome plant that you want to grow, and instead of using phosphorus, nitrogen, so all the different chemicals that make up fertilizer, you just grab nitrate and pump the ground full of a whole ton of nitrate, and it dies. Now, it doesn't mean that there are some places where reading it literally or reading this as history might be one of the helpful readings, but it's never just one. And there's plenty of times it's not the case. In fact, Augustine wrote a book called On the Literal Reading of Genesis, in which, very early on, he says, obviously, God did not create the world in 6 24-hour days, which, of course, is what literal means. He means something very different by literal. God didn't create in 6 24-hour days, and it's important to clarify this if people that think so are causing trouble in the church. But if they aren't, don't worry about clarifying it to them. And it's an aside he makes in it to basically say, reading this literally has nothing to do with literal as literal means after the Enlightenment. When literal is informed by a scientific mind, then we don't mean the same thing. Aquinas in the Summa says, to read the Bible literally is to read it as God intends it to be read.
Which is to say, according to genre, according to purpose, according to intent, according to the redactions, according to the things that go in to make a piece of literature. Which is all higher criticism, I say.
And Jesus even tells us how things are to be read. Sometimes you've heard it read this way, but I'm going to tell you to read it this way.
Oh, that causes an unbelievable amount of consternation when you talk to students about that, and it's clear that Jesus is altering some of the ways that's been read historically. Mm-hmm. They've never been offered that information in church. I'm going to keep saying this. If the church does not get better at systemic Christian education, you're going to keep creating this sort of I don't know, this group of people who can't begin to think coherently and comprehensively about how faith is supposed to operate in their lives. Now then, back to what you were saying, though, and I like this because I think it's Stephen Prothero, Boise, isn't it? He's the one at Boston University, Boston College. Great guy, great professor, great writer. And he talks about the Talmud, and he would say there is this piece in there where Shammai and Hillel, the two big, rabbinical minds, they're always arguing back and forth in this midrash fashion. And then the text says, these are the words of Shammai and Hillel, and they are both the words of God. Now, how's that possible when they disagree so utterly with each other? Well, it's because there's no sense in which they believe that these words are literally, as we mean literally, to be taken as this is what it actually means. It is this sort of discussion, this sort of trying to get at the truth that's happening. And that in itself is a sort of a truth. And if you're reading the Bible as a conversation, which I think most of the Tanakh actually is, it's this amazing conversation. And it's clear that the conversation continues. And the students have lost this, and the church sometimes loses it. Paul and James and Peter, these are Jews. And they grew up with that tradition. They grew up with that rabbinic tradition. Well, not the rabbinic, but they had the rabbis there. And they grew up with that tradition where they understand that this is a conversation. And so when James and Paul disagree, it's not like as a Bible reader, you have to go, oh, shit, what do I do now? You say, well, of course they disagree because they see this thing differently. But once you introduce the idea that these are the actual words of God, you've got a problem, which we're going to get to eventually.
Yeah.
But quickly to finish, because I said something about the Quran also. Reza Aslan, in his amazing book, No God But God, talks about the process by which the Quran itself, which, for Muslims, are the actual words of God. And so therefore, because they aren't mediated through a context or a culture, they have to be binding for all time. And so Aslan points out that what they did is they create the hadith, the sayings and deeds of the prophet. And so the hadith functioned by a chain of authorities. So that if one generation from Muhammad's death, someone said, well, I remember the prophet saying this, well, that goes into the hadith. Well, by the third generation, obviously, you have people who have vested interests, and they begin to create these fake chains of authority. So now the entire hadith tradition manages to subvert the text, which is supposed to be read literally by Muslims. So there's no such thing as a literal reading of either the Bible or the Quran, if by literal you mean the words actually mean what I think they mean in this time and place.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to work very well.
It has being slightly subversive. I thought it might help just to, if you're hanging out with evangelicals and explaining this is going to freak them out. So you could do it this way. Here's a nice little fun way of how to take the Bible literally. You tell them that you say, look, I'm with Augustine and I'm with Aquinas. Like the literal reading is reading the Bible as God intends it to be read. This is the historic reading. This is what it always has meant in the church. And when you see Jesus reading Scripture, and when you see him giving us, revealing to us, Jesus, the Word of God, what the Word means, it's almost always pointing to embodying greater compassion and justice. So what happened the first time the people of God took Jericho? You sang marching around it till the walls fell down. And then you went into it and killed everyone. Now, Luke tells us Jesus, before he went to Jerusalem, taking the world on behalf of the God of love, went through Jericho. They were singing because Jesus just healed a blind man. And what happened? He decides we're going to go to the very heart of Jericho, go to the heart of the problem, Zacchaeus, and we're going to make everyone go to their biggest other and have a party for the kingdom of God. That's what happens when the Word of God reads the Word of God. You read in the Old Testament, and you go through the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, well, you heard this, but here was the point, not to look at people in anger. Become a person that doesn't do that. The point of not having sex with your neighbor's wife is such that you don't look at women and turn them into objects.
Right.
The reason I told you not just to kill people all the time is because you're actually supposed to be relating to others in a way you don't create conditions for killing each other. So you start to reread it, and so and then they start to get iffy, and then you go, and this isn't me, like Paul in 2 Timothy, and he didn't write it, but you don't want to burst their bubble yet. He said that all Scripture is God breathed, and then they go, yeah, and it's useful. God breathed Scripture is useful. They're nodding. For teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the servant of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. So if we are to take these Scriptures that are God-breathed, what are they God-breathed for? but the transformation of a person to embody materially in the world the cruciform shape of life. It's for discipleship. It doesn't say all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for science class, philosophical cosmology, and biology or any of that. It's for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, which is the embodied justice of God. And that's why it's there. So if we want to take the Bible literally, people, then we have to let Jesus teach us how to read it as the loving, compassionate, justice-inspired person, the servant of all servants. And then we can take the Bible literally, which actually requires us plenty of times to read it metaphorically and all these other types of ways. But I swear, like, the number of times I've ran up on people just insisting to use the word, I've been trying to come up with a way of then just taking the word and redefining it. And if you have Timothy, Aquinas, and Augustine on your side, it really helps.
It's a pretty good chain of authorities, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, but anyway, so
so
we're going to pause here, and in the next 6, we're going to do in the same length as this, but in the next episode.
Yeah. Of course we are.
So Homebrewed Christianity listeners, just be prepared, because next week it will start with something you learn in Religion 101, that God is not a man.